My name is Darci Stone, and last year I was the grand prize winner with Writers of the Future. Yay!
Nice.
So, that's my claim to fame. I'm also married to Eric James Stone, who's a local writer. You may know him. And so let's quickly introduce the rest of us and we'll get going.
My name is Peter Orullian. I write epic fantasy for Tor, and the thing I'm working on now is urban fantasy collaboration with Brandon Sanderson.
My name is Cedar Sanderson. I'm an author, an artist, and would probably landed me on the panel as I'm a scientist. I don't have an unhealthy obsession with poisons. It's just that they're really interesting.
She is literally the person they made that meme about clearing out a writer's search history because of the writer. She's also no relation to Brandon Sanderson.
Oh no, but there's a funny story about the two of us in the con in the hotel.
Not in public. So I'm Dr. Nikhil Rao. I am a child psychiatrist, and when I signed up for this panel, I actually thought it was on poisonous personalities. But I'm still okay because I'm also an ecologist, and I've actually got an entry in an anthology coming out this fall, Stellaris. It'll be bookstores everywhere. Pick it up.
All right, yes, and I teach high school science, so I've taught earth science and then physics and chemistry. So, the opening question I want to bring with this, first off, I had a similar reaction to you. When I first read the title, dealing with poisonous characters, I was like, do they mean like toxic personalities? That's what I thought. Or like, they'll kill you. So just so everyone is clear, the direction we are going to take this panel is literally physically poisonous. Okay, so don't act surprised when that's what we start talking about. Star Trek, you know, all the aliens in Star Trek we have in our mind that they look just like us, right? Except for they have a different forehead or earlobes. So what we're going to be talking about here is what if, you know, aliens, or they don't have to be aliens, but characters in your story are biologically different enough from us to be poisonous or dangerous. So I want to start by asking, brainstorm, what are ways that a character could theoretically be toxic to humans?
So this is something I actually deal with every day. I work with critically ill children primarily, so most of the kids I work with have some sort of immunosuppression going on, some sort of infectivity going on. I am a person who does not have those things going on, which means I carry bugs on me that would be deadly to them if they got them. And it actually gets even more complicated there, because take two kids with cystic fibrosis, for instance. Cystic fibrosis, you have all these crypts in your lungs that retain stuff, retain goo and organisms and things that, again, to people that are healthy are not a problem. But they've each got basically these micro laboratories of infectious disease vectors. Fine to be around one of them if you're not immunocompromised, but if you are, it's a problem. So two kids with CF can never be in the same room. Especially once they get to a certain level of illness. So imagine what that's like. Your peers, the people that you can actually most relate to, who can help you get through this stuff. You got to FaceTime them. Imagine what that was like 10 years ago when you couldn't even be in the same room with them and you had no way to do things like that. So that's something you can think about extrapolating to sci-fi, to different colonies, right? If you're there on Tau Ceti, totally fine, no big deal. It's normal flora for us, but we step over to the Alpha Centauri settlement, and oops, we kind of wiped them out with the plague. So this, like you mentioned, this doesn't even have to be about aliens or about other life forms. This can be about humans, completely human humans that are just hanging out and doing nothing.
Yeah, I mean, we all know what happened when Europeans came to the Americas and brought all of their new diseases with them. So as we colonize different planets, I hadn't even thought of that, but we could become poisonous to each other. Any other ideas of just how?
Well, I spend most of my days in a chemistry lab, and I spend a lot of my time in love. So when I was reading the blurb about the poisonous characters, my immediate thought was, well, what if the alien, their skin oils, their skin secretions are like really acidic or really basic, and that's obviously, if that comes in contact with our skin, it's going to be a bad thing. But there's also the fact that strong acids in particular, you've got strong fumes. And if you breathe that in, it will do bad things to your lungs.
I've seen it used, even just recently, not as a, like a scale thing, but there's a show that my daughter, she's 14, and she loves these shows like Blacklist. Have you seen Blacklist?
Oh, yeah.
And then one of the episodes of Blacklist is there's a scientist who engineers a way for someone to actually be a carrier for deadly poison for a specific person. It's engineered for an individual. And I find that, as a writer, a really interesting idea. Like, there's these larger issues where people could be toxic to one another, but the idea of being able to engineer it, this was done in Star Trek too. There was in Next Generation, there was an episode where a person was an assassin and they just had to touch them and they would die. But I really like, I don't have a lot to say about that because science is not my expertise, but I will say that as a writer, the notion in the science fiction context where you could engineer something so that literally you are toxic to an individual, so your assassination becomes all about just proximity, is really interesting.
And that's not outside and not far outside the bounds of scientific possibility now that we could engineer either a pathogen or something that would specifically work with one person's gene to their genetic makeup to kill one person. There's you can micro-engineer a plague that would kill very specific people that have genetic traits. So, like, if you wanted to wipe out all blondes, that's what Bringo did for your guy. Yeah. So, that's actually within the realm of scientific possibility, so it's not hard to extrapolate that into a science fiction story or an alien race where everybody else, well, that actually almost gets into allergies too. Specific people are allergic. You might be allergic to the alien race. Not all humans, but then suddenly this one human comes in contact with them.
And that's important. There's actually multiple different levels of incompatibility, right? We can have acids, bases, gases. Biological incompatibility comes in several different forms. We've got prions, we've got allergies, which is distinct from things like microbes. And then at higher levels, you've got basic physical incompatibility to things like gravity or chemistry.
Yeah. So along those lines, like we kind of already mentioned this, but one of the most obvious things is breathing. If humans cannot last very long if we don't have the right gases in what we're breathing. So what if there was a race of aliens that, for example, needed chlorine in the gas to stay alive, which for a human would kill us quickly? Would we be able to establish relations with those type of creatures, and how would it change our interactions?
I think someone obviously wouldn't be able to have face-to-face in the same room interactions. I don't know how many people here have read any of James White's Secretary General books. They're excellent if you're interested in both medicine and science fiction. That's one of the big things in the books is they're trying to build all the different habitats for this giant hospital in space where all these diverse alien species wind up, but some of them are completely incompatible with, they might breathe chlorine or they might live under.
So then does the writer, if they want to be able to have interaction, because in the absence of interaction, I'm not sure there's much of a story, do they have to do the gymnastics in order to have these people together, like people are in some kind of suits that contain what is toxic to the person they're talking to? I don't know, because I haven't read a lot of these kinds of novels. I'm just positing.
Yeah, I think it's fertile hard SF, and something they have been exploring since the 30s and 40s, I think. And chlorine specifically is a breathable thing for other life forms, comes up all the time, which as a biologist I get confused by because we don't really have a reason for that. But I guess it was just on people's minds, so that's what they wrote. And it's still on our minds.
Mustard gas.
That's probably what it was. Use the mic.
Yes, probably. Yes.
Yeah, we don't want Okay. But as far as the relations between species, do you think two species that are mutually toxic? What?
Is there another panel going on back there?
I think we pissed off the toxic beings.
Skynet.
The attack is
Can we coexist with Skynet?
So, could these two races, like, do you think we could establish relationships with another species if we were toxic, or would that not be a viable option?
I think that the way we generally speak of establishing any kind of contact with aliens, we rarely see it written or have an urge to write it as far as suddenly face-to-face. So there's usually some kind of radio communication or some kind of long-distance communication first. And I suppose you could even write a story where they didn't know they were poisonous until they were suddenly face-to-face and realized that we always assume that our air gases are what's necessary to sustain life, and then suddenly the ship comes and that they need, let's go with something a little more realistic than chlorine, so they need a much higher concentration of carbon dioxide than we do, and they don't need oxygen at all, so you can kind of go plant-like. You wouldn't know, and that could even be a plot point of we've connected online and we've come together in the same space, and then suddenly we realize there's problems.
So I always think it's fascinating how technology changes culture and changes our perception of like what it means to interact with other people. You know, for my parents' generation, the idea that you could form entire friendships via an electronic medium without ever seeing their picture or without ever hearing their voice is kind of a strange thing. But to those of us who've kind of actually embraced the internet age, that's not so surprising. I mean, I've got 5 or 6 friends in this room, and the very first time I ever met any of them was at LTUE last year, but our friendships were several years old by then. So I think if you asked someone 40 years ago, would this be an impediment? They would have said, absolutely. How can you have a relationship with someone you can't be in the same room with? So I think that certainly it wouldn't be an impediment to communicating and to working together. But then the question remains, well, would that level of separation pose barriers? Let's say we interacted with 2 different alien races, one of which could share a habitat and things like touch and face-to-face with us, and one who couldn't. Equally friendly, equally personality compatible, equally societally compatible. Does the race that requires us to be separate from them somehow lag behind in relationship just because we can't share a physical space?
I think it's a really interesting question, because I think there's a real debate on whether it's actual friendship if it's all virtual. Is the level of trust commensurate with what happens with what I would call real human interaction? So I would, and I think that for it to be believable in fiction, that would become a huge barrier. I think you could do trade. There could be all kinds of resource sharing. There could be defense sort of networks where maybe they have an advanced technology and you work out some sort of treaty. All of those things are really interesting. But my view would be, at the end of the day, what drives most really, really successful fiction is character interaction. And I think it would be very, very difficult to establish proper emotional investment when those 2 characters can't really come together. Like, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think even today we see the debate on whether or not friendships that are formed entirely virtually have the same sort of strength of loyalty, strength of emotional bonding that happens when people get in a room. And for me, it's the same. It's part and parcel of the argument of the difference between the community that grows up around a bricks and mortar bookstore and the people that give me recommendations on Amazon.
I'm going to step a little bit further back in time than Dr. Nick's parents and go to grandparents, or even back further than that. Letter writing was a huge thing, and there are some very well-known and documented cases of deep, fast friendship between people that weren't even on the same continent and wrote letters back and forth to one another that might take months to go back and forth. And I don't think it's debatable that these people were friends, that they trusted each other, that they shared things that they might not share with their intimate household people with. So I think that it's certainly possible to say that we can develop a relationship with someone that's not in the same room with us, the same house, the same continent, the same planet, possibly. So going back to the age of pen pals, and some of these people had never met and never got to meet in person.
Or interstellar pen pals. Kind of changing now to the issue of size. In our minds, you know, most aliens we're picturing as being similar in size to us. But how would we interact with other creatures that are either much, much bigger than we are or much, much smaller, and how would that affect things? Like, let's say that you met an intelligent species and they're as big as grasshoppers. Like, how do you prevent that physical inconsistency from, you know, causing trouble between species?
So I think that's actually kind of interesting, right? Because as humans, if something is substantially larger than us, we're scared of it. Or if it's substantially smaller than us, it's cute or disgusting.
Also legs. The more legs they have.
Right, and so that's really fascinating, actually, because a lot of the visceral reactions to different body forms and different sizes are hard-coded in our genetics. Like, you can actually trace back the gene in frogs that corresponds to the gene in humans that makes us afraid of snakes. Snakes, blood, and spiders, by the way, are the 3 true genetic fears. It's not someone's fault if they faint at the sight of blood. It's actually their genetics.
What was the third one? It was snakes, blood, and
Spiders. Yeah.
Where does the spider one come from?
Probably because spiders were major predators of mice. And we do come from a mouse-like ancestor not so long ago. But yeah, that's really fascinating. How does it look like? How does it look like when you can't even share the same set of interfaces? You know, how can you actually coexist when, you know, one being needs a 10-foot tall chair and you need a 3-foot tall chair? Or how do you adapt to deal with this?
Or imagine if you were in the same room together, how easy it would be to accidentally step on an alien the size of a grasshopper, and what political ramifications would that have?
You know, what kind of left to mind is you can't successfully write aliens until you humanize them. So, you know, we can extrapolate all kinds of sizes and toxicities and all of these things, and they're super interesting thought experiment. But it's a successful piece of fiction if you don't somehow humanize them, so that, because that's your experience. You can't write outside your experience as a human, or you can try, but I don't think that that's going to be a successful piece of fiction. The example I would give is Kafka's Metamorphosis. And there's a moment when what I call Gregor Bug, the son, is trying to get away. And he's afraid, and he's smaller now, he's more vulnerable. And Dad throws an apple at him. The apple lodges in his back, and over the course of the story, rots. But the moment where he's trying to get away, and he's just fearful because all of a sudden he's now, he's smaller, he's more vulnerable, is really powerful. But what Kafka does is, he's not this cockroach. It's Gregor. And we have all this human attachment to the same fears and concerns and familial relationships he has, and that's why we care. We don't care because he is cockroach. And that's, for me, that's the masterpiece of Metamorphosis, is that he's taken something that is foreign and he's humanized it, and he's made us care. And so that's why, frankly, I think that all of these, you know, Star Trek and all these stories, I take your point that they're kind of all just small, but at the end of the day, the interactions they have are based upon human emotions, right? And, you know, if you posit an emotion that's not human, that might be interesting from an intellectual perspective, but the emotional resonance is going to lack.
In Lovecraft's mythos, Cthulhu, the elder gods, in the Lovecraftian mythos, the elder gods, the unknowable ones, drive men mad because their thoughts are broadcast and they're so alien and unknowable that they're toxic on the personality level more because it literally strips the sanity from the mind. So that's an example of an alien that is toxic and that I think was successfully written into stories without having humanized them at all. Of course, they're not exactly the heroes of the piece, but I think you can successfully write aliens that are not human. I don't think that if we follow some of the standard evolutionary guidelines that we know of, that we're going to see that there's always going to be something to be afraid of. There's always going to be something that motivates them. Otherwise, why did they leave their planet and go into space? So that then becomes the thing of finding the commonalities.
Okay, so we're going to take it to the next level now. What if these other creatures are not only poisonous to us, but there's a relationship, for example, like a vampire, where they feed off of us, okay? So they are overtly hostile to us, but they don't necessarily do it because they hate us. We're just their only food source, okay? So how would could there be a relationship with those kinds of situations?
I have a buddy with 3 pugs, and that's basically what they are. They're completely incapable of independent function and completely dependent on us, and we have relationships, right? So I think mutualism is an interesting concept, right? So we will accept a pretty heavy cost to ourselves if we perceive a pretty important benefit, and that benefit doesn't have to be material. It can be, I feel better, right? Because no one sits there and does the calculus of, oh, this makes me more evolutionary fit, because no, that's not what happens. It feels good, right? So I think it's possible that we would accept something like that as long as there was enough benefit to us, and again, not even in a purely selfish sense. But if my dog turned into some sort of vampire thing tomorrow, then I'd probably still want even more dogs.
I was going to say, a good parasite does not kill its host. And then, of course, the thing that goes along with that is that we are humans, we will pack bond with anything. I cried yesterday when I read about opportunity. So it's one of those things of, yeah, I can totally see, okay, well, there's a lot of vampire fiction where the vampires are, So even if they're feeding off of us, if they're giving us something in return, and a lot of vampire fiction seems to posit that that's going to be some kind of sexual gratification, we will let them feed on us and build a relationship, however warped it may be.
Okay, so obviously there's a reason for them to keep us around because they need us. You were saying as long as there was a benefit for us, we may be willing to participate in the relationship. What types of benefits would be big enough that we, put up with being a food source?
So in mixed species associations where there is some sense of one species directly taking from the other species, it's always about survival and defense, always. Well, I shouldn't say always. It can also be about spotting resources. So one of the mixed species associations I'm really interested in is that between 2 different types of monkeys, one much smaller than the other. Now, the tinier monkeys are basically freeloaders if you look at it a certain way, because they always hide behind the bigger monkeys when there's a predator. It's never the tiny monkeys that get eaten, it's always the big monkeys that get eaten. On the other hand, the tiny monkeys are much more likely to spot the predator in the first place, and they're also much more likely to spot food sources. So again, the tiny monkeys totally dependent on the big monkeys. In troops where they don't have big monkeys, they basically go extinct. Whereas the big monkeys can survive on their own without the small monkeys.
And a little bit even more alien thing is the giant tubeworms that we've found around deep sea vents cannot actually absorb the nutrients around them. They are dependent on a microbe that uses them for shelter. The microbe is chemotroph and breaks the nutrition down in such a way that the tubeworms can use it. So there's not really anything going on there for the microbe except for the fact that the tubeworm is big and defends it. So there's mutualism, commensalism is fascinating, and there's a lot of it out there. I'm going to come into something a little bit weirder, which is that most of us, when we think of intestinal parasites, it's ew, ick, give me some medicine, get that thing out of me. Right now, they're actually talking about developing a medical therapy based on giving you an intestinal parasite deliberately, because it looks like the rise in autoimmune syndromes, and I was particularly interested in this because my dad deals with Crohn's. There's a guy that is deliberately ingesting worms because it puts his Crohn's into remission. Gives his immune system something to do. So he's willing to take on what could potentially be a deadly infection because it makes him less sick. Now, they're using a specific species that breaks down after 6 weeks in the human body, and it doesn't insist, so he's not going to get cysts in his brain or his eyes. But it's a very interesting take on internal parasites, which normally are a bad thing, and suddenly maybe they could be useful.
You mentioned earlier that it doesn't necessarily have to be so poisonous that it kills us. There's other degrees of discomfort, like allergies. It makes you sneeze, or maybe it just makes you physically uncomfortable. So could you think of any, in what ways might another creature just make our lives uncomfortable, and then how would that affect our relationship? So like, for example, I am allergic to cats. So let's say we find an alien species that has the same dander as cats, okay? Like just being in a room with them would be very uncomfortable for me. I would be sneezing, my eyes would be watering. It would be hard for me to, develop a close friendship. So what are some other things that might happen?
Well, imagine that we came up with an alien species that secreted urushiol, which is the active ingredient in poison ivy and poison oak. And furthermore, it transfers. So any place that alien has touched, if you touch it, you're going to wind up with a rash.
I think smell is also an important one. Like, what if we meet a species that just stinks really bad?
So smell is actually the one I'm worried about the least, because we habituate to smells really quickly as someone who spends a lot of time on medical wards and used to work on farms. You get used to it really quickly. I got to the point, actually, where for a few years, whenever I'd smell cow manure, I'd actually feel nostalgic and feel good, because I was so used to it, and it brought back good memories.
You're not the only
but the whole, I just had to inject a funny comment here. I was thinking about your allergy to cats, and I was imagining the entire Man Kazunawar's short story about the cats shaving themselves so that people wouldn't react to them.
One book that I read recently is, I'm trying to think what it's called, Starplex by, Sawyer is his last name. But one of the things I really liked about it is he has a variety of alien species on there that are living together on a spaceship, and he talks about all of the compromises they have to make to try to satisfy each other. So like one species is used to really strong gravity. The other one is used to weak gravity. So how do you pick a number in between where you can both, adapt? One of the species is really sensitive to smell, and so the other species has to bathe frequently. Otherwise, it's just very impolite. But it was an interesting book, watching these characters interact with each other in these types of ways where, any area of the ship that all of the species frequented had to be kept at a certain temperature, which for the humans was uncomfortably cold, but so at what point, what are things we're willing to sacrifice and adapt, and at what point do we draw the line and say, no, you have to be the ones to resolve this issue, we don't want to deal with it?
Well, I think that depends on how much we like them, right? I recently became engaged, and so that's interesting, right? She and I are very different people with very different health issues and very different religious backgrounds. So you have to negotiate, right? And so, the more you like someone, the more you negotiate. That's actually why I left my last relationship. I was like, wow, you don't negotiate at all, I'm done. But on a more serious note, I think that's going to be a litmus test for whether these alliances work or not. if the alien species is willing to push you to the point of extreme discomfort or even requiring bodily modification in order to maintain something with you, but they're not willing to give back, that's where you jump ship, I think, because that tells you how much you trust them.
And also on a biological note, human beings are really darned adaptable. I mean, we established colonies on 7 continents, including one that'll kill you if you don't think twice and 3 times about whatever you're going to do that day. And we've explored down to some of the deepest trenches in the ocean, and we've gone out in space. And so I think that I'm not saying that humans have to adapt, but I think that as humans we can and do adapt to some pretty extreme environments already.
I think, Nick, you may have already kind of answered this a little bit, as what sort of reward is available to the person who's making a compromise. So, yeah, I don't have a lot to say on that.
Now, what about the other direction? What if there's something about humans that we meet, another species out there, and there's something about us that is toxic or poisonous to them? What do you think we as a species would just take advantage of that to annihilate the others? Or how willing would we be to help protect them if they are the ones at risk?
Some of that depends on how cute they are.
Do they sparkle?
Well, no, seriously. I mean, when I was taking invertebrate zoology, we were talking about endangered species and things. The cute and cuddly and fluffy animals that are endangered get lots of press and protection, and in some places have been able to be removed from the endangered species list. But nobody loves freshwater mussels. Because, well, I mean, when you kill them and take their shell apart and make buttons out of them, they're really pretty, but they're dead.
All right. Let's go ahead then and start kind of opening up if there's any comments or questions or.
I have 2 questions if that's okay. So for the scientists of you, are there any certain poisons that, just like poisons in general, for humans at least, that either you find most interesting or most potent, or like, so we don't actually have to dirty our search history?
Chlorine gas, that's his favorite.
Make your search history as dirty as you like it. You're a writer, you have an excuse.
Your personal favorites, though?
I don't know. I mean, I'm fascinated by plant poisons because I've been interested in botany since I was a little girl. So I tend to look at, like, my mother-in-law grows castor beans in her garden because they're pretty, and I'm looking at them and going, ricin, that's really deadly. But it's one of those things of, as far as poisons go, you kind of want to decide, okay, what am I doing with this poison? Is it slow acting? Is it quick? Is it like curare on a blow dart where it's a paralytic and it's quick? Or is it more like ingesting Jensen weed where you wind up with hallucinations and delusions and slowly go very insane because you've been eating a plant that has toxic substances in it?
So I know at least 1,000 ways to kill a person with medications, but we won't go there today. Like I mentioned, I used to be an ecologist. I guess I technically still am. There's no certification or membership required. But it's interesting. You talk to a sea biologist, you talk to a land biologist, you talk to bird people or monkey people, or even paleontologists. Do you know what they all think the weirdest animal of all time is? Platypus, that's right. Doesn't matter how smart you are, doesn't matter how well you know all animals, it's still the platypus, just like it was since anybody's been 3. They're venomous. They're a venomous mammal that lays eggs. That's just weird.
And not only are they venomous, but they don't bite you. The venom is injected by their feet, like the spur on the side of their foot. Who does that?
So if I was ever to actually kill someone with a poison, it would be with platypus venom, because it's hilarious.
Now I want to see that on a CSI episode. Yes. Also, I do want to mention with poisons, like they don't have to be chemical poisons. For example, if the other planet has really high levels of radiation, then they might just, be radioactive. They're just emitting a lot of, alpha and beta decay, and that would be causing cancer, for humanoid species. Or similarly, like our hearts, if you get the right magnetic field near a human heart, it can totally throw off your rhythms. So I don't know why, but if their bodies had some kind of a strange magnetic field, it could throw off our brains and our hearts and just cause all sorts of
Electric eels?
Yeah. So, it doesn't have to be a chemical poison. It can be some kind of a physical poison. Was there a question?
So as we all become cyborgs, how do you think technological poison work?
So by technological poison, are you talking about poison using technology or a poison against technology?
So like a computer virus?
Like a virus that's implanted in your DNA that only attacks mechanical.
We've already done that.
Right.
No, I'm serious.
No,
we have
that
written
only
code.
attacks. Yeah.
We have written computer code into DNA, so the virus we can already view that.
So that actually happened last week. They actually synthesized a strand of DNA with a computer virus on it. So then when the DNA got read by this DNA machine, it broke the DNA machine and then tried to destroy the lab. I thought that was really cool. But you also have to be really dumb to connect your synthesizer and that to like directly doing code. So I'm not sure what was involved there. But
let me put it this way. In my lab, which is owned by one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, there is an instrument that is connected to the internet and it is running Windows XP. It scares the Jesus out of me.
But so technological poisons are a whole nother level of fascination. Right now we just talk about silicon, but there's a lot of other things out there. There's fiber optics, there's all these other things going on. All of these rely on the transmission of electrons in certain ways, which only happens in certain conditions, kind of like our bodies. So you can actually make a computer too cold to work. It's not actually the battery that's being problematic. The electrons don't flow through the silicon below certain temperatures, just as an example. So you can actually disrupt the actual physical substrate of the chips themselves and attack it physically the same way we attack the body.
And there are microbes that eat plastic.
Just very slow.
That's enough.
All right, there's a question in the back.
When it comes to us meeting other species that potentially be uncomfortable to us, or vice versa, would our option of whether we coexist or exploit or even exterminate kind of depend on their utility to us? Like whether maybe there's a species that I don't know, it gives us allergy to something, but I don't know, they shit gold.
Unfortunately, I think that human history has taught us that yes, if we're not getting something useful from them, this is probably dangerous for their survival. What are your thoughts?
So I think a lot depends on what things are like when we visit outer space, right? And then under what situation we are when we are this interstellar role. Are we running away from alien usurpers? Then what we need more than anything else is allies. Then we're going to go to the mat to try to make it work, no matter how weird they are. On the other hand, if we're a very dominant civilization and they're in our way, they're going to become either food or resource pretty quickly. And if it's just us alone out there exploring for exploring's sake, if this is a scientific vessel full of people that are bright-eyed, bushy-tailed idealists, then they're going to want to work with these guys just to learn more about the universe. So I think it's totally dependent on conditions, but I think there's actually more than just we get value out of you that determines whether or not we ally. Again, like Cedar mentioned, we will do a lot for a cute little endangered animal. Not enough for my South American monkeys, by the way. Forest fragmentation is still a problem, and it's mostly because we eat too much beef. But on a more serious note, it doesn't have to be resource, it just has to be value to us in our capacities as fundamentally emotional creatures. Trust me, I get absolutely no financial value out of the time I spend at the children's hospital. If I'd stayed in adult medicine, I'd be making twice as much money. And I'm not alone in that. Every teacher you've ever met, everybody who's ever jumped into a burning building, we do things because they make us feel good, but that doesn't mean we have to have a resource benefit there.
Yeah, and I think we also have to take into account the law of unintended consequences that just like, when the Europeans came to the Americas, they weren't intentionally bringing smallpox to eradicate the locals, but it happened. And so I think as we interact with other creatures and other species, there may be quite a bit of harm both directions that wasn't even on purpose, but it's going to be happening, and how we respond to it, remains to be seen.
Would that prematurely determine our interaction with them? Would we have that on our mind? That's why when we discover new civilizations most of the time, when like very insulated ones, we are careful about things like that, so we don't accidentally get smallpox or whatever and kill them by accident. So we probably do the same thing with alien species, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we have enough tech that we can predict some of those things, but I think that there probably would be unforeseen things that would, would be hard to predict in advance. So, okay, we're down to our last 5 minutes.
So you kind of mentioned earlier how when we came in, we've gone to different continents, and we came here to the Americas and killed a bunch of people because they hadn't been exposed to the certain germs and organisms and such that we had, viruses and whatnot. And I've heard a lot of talk about how that would be the same thing with time travel. We go to different places and they just, we go forward in time, we would die, but we would kill everyone else who went back in time. Is that, anything else?
Actually, I think it would go both ways. If we went forward in time, we could potentially kill them, and they could potentially kill us, and vice versa. Most pathogens mutate, and some pathogens mutate very rapidly, which is why we do the flu shot every year. It's still a crapshoot whether or not it works. So I think that the time travel thing, as far as being pathogenic in either direction, that works, because things do change, and we've eradicated smallpox. So if someone traveled from 100 years ago into now carrying smallpox, it would be a big issue. So.
And it is interesting to note that the more different a species is from us, the less likely that any kind of diseases are going to be an issue. I know, in War of the Worlds, one of the big premises is that these aliens come here and then they die of smallpox or whatever. That's actually very unlikely because in order for a species to evolve a bacteria or a virus that targets you, they have to be very similar to you, which is why, as humans, we don't usually die from fish viruses just because our physiology is too different.
So
and actually,
so bioweapons basically be free and effective when we're talking about completely alien biologies?
Yeah, I mean, if we had done the research to know that it targeted them, then that would be different. But as far as just sending smallpox to an alien planet and hoping to get lucky, it would be very unlikely.
That said, I've read in Guns, Germs, and Steel that most of the major plagues we've had are in a sense a biological mistake, because a major plague that wipes out its host is,
a stupid plague.
And most of them have jumped species from similar species. So that's a possibility too.
There's a possibility.
That would kill off.
But even on Earth, you're jumping between species that at least share a common ancestor.
Right.
Whereas a complete alien creature.
Well, and the other thing about zoonosis too is that the closer you are in proximity for the longer amount of time, the more likely you are to have a jump between the human host and the microbe, because it's swine flu is a big a swine thing is a big concern right now for what I do, because we source our material from pigs, and China has a lot of difficulty with this because they live in very close proximity to their livestock in ways that Americans wouldn't consider doing. So they wind up with sharing infections. So I think that would be an interesting premise where we've coexisted with an alien species and suddenly something was able to jump between us.
All right, I think we're about out of time, so are there any closing thoughts before we end the panel?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to expand on the idea of bacteria real quick. We think of pathogens, right? But they're actually everywhere. They're in the soil, they're in stones, they're in the water. If we think outside that box, a lot of bacteria, all they do is they digest organic material that's sitting right there, and then they eat it. They're not infectious. So what if we dropped a plant matter bacteria that digests dying plants, but we had evolved it so that it could just digest through these aliens? We don't have to worry about transfectivity either way. We just have to have a bacteria that's robust enough to eat through things.
Yeah, my husband and I have a joke that, more and more nowadays they're finding that like our gut bacteria have all sorts of other side effects. So whenever they find anything new, we're always like, oh, I bet you it's our gut bacteria. That's what causes Parkinson's disease. It's our gut bacteria, that's what causes ADHD. So it would be interesting to see, how does our gut bacteria play, when we meet these new alien species? Is our gut bacteria going to cause problems for them? But one thing I do want to say is just, I know for myself when I read sci-fi, especially if it's trying to be hard sci-fi, it's always fun to see alien species that have kind of been thought through that aren't just the Star Trek aliens. They have more than a forehead ridge, that there's actually some unique xenobiology going on. So if that is a direction you want to go, those novels are usually very interesting to read.